Would you believe that the difference between failing the USMLEs and scoring in the 260s or higher could be as simple as changing how you use UWorld? It may sound too good to be true, but as a 99.9 percentile Step 1 score who matched at Harvard MGH, I've seen it happen time and again, including someone who failed Step 1 and in under 2 months scored a 262 on his NBME before passing his retake. For a lot of the exams that we've taken in our lives, if we get a question wrong, it is often because we just didn't know the required knowledge. And so it's sort of like holding a hammer. Everything ends up looking like a nail. And for the most part, everything can be treated like a nail in medical school until we get to the USMLEs. So for example, most med school exams are really about knowledge recall. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Professors who write the questions are not paid, they're not promoted, and they're not trained to teach. And so they are essentially incentivized to write easier questions, which end up being kind of the regurgitation type questions that you see on med school exams. It's sort of the equivalent of an ungraded assignment for them, and they're going to act accordingly. However, for the USMLEs, as we discussed, it isn't about regurgitating facts, but rather about applying concepts, which opens up a whole ton of new avenues to ask questions and to get them wrong. And so the key is that when you're reviewing questions, look at why you're missing them. Are you missing it because it's a key concept? Did you not actually understand what the question was asking? Did you eliminate an answer choice because one thing didn't feel right? I was talking to a student recently who she said that she constantly would get questions wrong that she knew the knowledge for. And as an example, she said that there was a question, she wants to go into pediatrics, and so she knows a ton about pediatric conditions, yet she still got a question wrong about Klinefelter syndrome. And she said that the reason was that everything fit with Klinefelter's, except the patient wasn't tall. And she was like, well, I thought the classic patient in Klinefelter's were tall. And so because it felt kind of uncomfortable to them, they eliminated the answer. Now, this is independent of knowledge. This is just the way that they wrote the question so that you had noise, you had something uncomfortable. They ended up eliminating that answer choice because it wasn't perfect and then choosing the next best answer, which obviously was a wrong answer. And so all of these things point to the fact that if you assume that everything is about knowledge, you're going to miss a large number of questions, especially if you know a lot of things already. That on one hand, knowing the question type, like is it a management question, is it diagnosis, is it pathology, is it ethics, can be helpful. However, what I would argue is that the impact of this strategy is limited and your time could be better spent elsewhere. So unlike the SATs where this advice is more common and frankly more helpful, or even the MCAT, for Step 1 and Step 2, most questions are going to be reasoning based and they're going to follow the famous two-step reasoning process. Knowing the second step, which is the question type, doesn't necessarily help with the first step, which is oftentimes understanding the underlying condition or knowing the diagnosis or something like that. Let's say that I know a question is about arrows. That doesn't necessarily help me identify the condition, which is maybe a myocardial infarction, or maybe it's gonna be heart failure, or maybe it's gonna be a PE, right? Knowing that I'm going to have to answer a question where the arrows are up or down is not going to help me really much at all with the first part, which is the critical part, which is understanding what condition it is. The other reason why people will sometimes say you need to read the question first is that there are some questions that can be answered without reading the entire vignette. Now, note that this is rare. I would estimate that maybe at most 1 to 2 questions per block, you could go through and just know the question, and by just reading the last sentence, not have to read the entire vignette. So what I would argue is that it's not worth spending the time reading the last sentence for every question just to get those few instances where it might help you. The other thing is that in a high stakes exam, how many students are really going to feel comfortable reading just the last sentence and say, oh, okay, now I don't need to read the vignette, or I don't need to read the stem, I'm just gonna answer it based off of this, right? Most people won't. And so realistically, you're still going to spend that time going back and reading the rest of the vignette. Again, the issue isn't that by reading the last sentence, you don't gain useful information. You do gain useful information. The question instead is, what is the best use of that time? And so I would argue that the best use of that time is to focus instead on connecting the different sentences and the signs and symptoms of the vignette. So students often look at each sentence independently and they fail to make crucial connections. So for example, let's say that a patient comes in and they've got chest pain and they're also tall and skinny. Oftentimes people will read those two things independently and they won't take the extra time to try to connect it and say, how could someone having acute onset chest pain and being tall and skinny be related? And so connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated information in the vignette is actually the more valuable skill and the more valuable use of time than spending that time reading the last sentence first. This strategy helps you build a comprehensive understanding of the case and leads to more accurate question answering.